A message from Sahasrahla. The place where you now stand was the Golden Land, but evil power turned it into the Dark World. The wizard has broken the Wise Men's seal and opened a gate to link the worlds at Hyrule Castle. In order to save this half of the world, the Light World, you must win back the Golden Power. You must also rescue the 7 maidens who Agahnim sent to the Dark World. This is Legendary Adventures, a Legend of Zelda playthrough podcast. This week we're venturing through the Dark World of A Link to the Past and taking a look at both the Light World and the Dark World as a whole. As I mentioned last week, this section begins the second act of A Link to the Past. I'm defining acts as distinct sections outlined not only by story beats, but the goals of the player. In the first act, players travel to dungeons to collect 3 pendants in order to acquire the Master Sword and face Agahnim. In this act, players will travel to dungeons to rescue the descendants of the Wise Men, the kidnapped maidens, and Princess Zelda in order to face Ganon. As we enter the second act, we have our first real chance to explore the Dark World. The layout here is very similar to that of the Light World. There are some differences, however. In place of the castle, there is the Pyramid of Power. Traveling west from the pyramid is impossible. There are also different obstacles, sometimes limiting player progression. And as we saw at Spectacle Rock, changes to the layout of the world that the player may be able to take advantage of to reach otherwise inaccessible areas of the Light World. This section is a continued slow reveal of the Dark World. The developers seem to be consciously introducing the concept to players step by step to avoid overwhelming them. Heading towards the Dark Palace, players will find an area which in the Light World featured many changes in elevation, but here it's all one single plane. There is now, however, a large hedge maze taking up most of the area. The hedge itself is overgrown, making the maze path more difficult to discern, but we get glimpses of it through thinner, more transparent sections of the maze. Next to the maze is the Dark World equivalent of the building that Sahasrahla hides in. Inside this building, we find someone who has been transformed into a tree-like creature. The creature says the golden power reflects the heart of the holder, and that the current holder is the Prince of Thieves, Ganon. We're told the appearance of the Dark World and the people in it are due to the influence of Ganon. The creature concludes saying, "What a mischievous thing to leave laying around, the power of gold, Triforce." This is, I believe, the first in-game reference to the Triforce in A Link to the Past. Prior to this, it's been referred to as the Golden Power or the Power of Gold. It's a nice reveal, I think, that the two are one and the same. Longtime Zelda fans and even those who just read the manual were likely well aware that the Golden Power and the Triforce were the same long before this point, however. Just east of the building, we find the entrance to the maze. A pair of arrows drawn on the ground guide the player through the entrance. After making it through the main overgrown block of the maze, players will discover they have a creature tailing them. It's a monkey named Kiki who loves rupees more than anything. It then asks for 10 rupees to accompany you. After reaching the door of the Dark Palace, Kiki asks for 100 rupees to open the door. It is ultimately required that you pay Kiki twice, for a total of 110 rupees to progress in the game. I myself entered this section with around 500 rupees banked, so it was no issue. I also can't recall ever coming to this section short of rupees, but I suppose that is possible, and that a player could be stopped here and be forced to grind for money. Once inside the Dark Palace, there are a couple of things that should be obvious right from the start. The first is the music. The new dungeon theme introduced in the Dark World features high strings as the backbone of the piece that give it a mildly frantic, uneasy feel. Lower strings play the melody. It is, in my opinion, a more ominous and unsettling piece compared to its Light World counterpart. The theming of this dungeon is far more generic. It's all gray stone with no true theme or gimmick to consider. As with most other dungeons in this game, the Dark Palace is separated into 2 distinct sections. It's worth noting, however, that unlike other dungeons in the game, the second section is not accessed through the use of the big key, but through the use of an item. The other thing to notice is how the entrance of the Dark Palace mirrors the Eastern Palace in the Light World. There are 3 doors right at the start. This time the doors to the east and west are closed. and the door in the center is open. Through the center door, players will find a locked door. They will also clearly be able to see that the doors on the east and west do not lead to dead ends this time. Players can open the doors to the east and west by stepping on camouflaged floor switches near the entrance. To the east, players find a room with a transporter. It leads to another room with a bombable wall, and then through a series of rooms with traps and obstacles. Notably, one room features conveyor belts that the players must contend with while dodging jellyfish-like enemies and avoiding spike traps. Another room features this game's reimagining of the Goria enemy from the first two games. They no longer throw boomerangs. They instead mirror Link's movements. Here we face a group of 3, 2 green, 1 red. The red will spit a fireball at Link if he is in direct line of sight. The green ones can be taken out with the sword. The bow is needed to take out the red one. Players must hit it by forcing it to walk into the path of a flying arrow. At the end of this path of challenges, players find the dungeon map and a key. A row of red, bouncing, smiling pegs prevent the player from moving forward and forcing them to backtrack at this point unless they saved tackling this wing until later in the dungeon after acquiring the dungeon item. Through the central room, there is a room with 2 forking paths, which sit over a lower room that players must purposely fall in. The drop on the west side is accomplished by placing a bomb on a cracked area of the path, then dropping down the hole. Players will find the big key down this path. Players should take the eastern path to reach the big chest. They will have to make sure a crystal switch is set with blue blocks raised to pass through a few rooms to get there, including a room with a collapsing bridge and a maze room that must be navigated in darkness. Notably, this maze room features fire-breathing enemies. In the Game Boy Advance version, the fire attack can only be seen when illuminated by Link's lantern light. Inside the big chest, players will find the hammer. Unlike the hammer in Zelda 2, this hammer can be used in combat. It's essential for defeating turtle-like enemies found in this dungeon. It can also be used to knock down raised pegs. The hammer is required to complete this dungeon. With the right manipulation of a crystal switch, players can travel to the rooms on the east side of the dungeon. In one room, a door is closed and will not open unless a switch on the floor is pressed. However, unlike other switches which require only one press to open the door, this one must be continually pressed. The solution is to push a statue over it. Beyond that door, players will find a room that seemingly ends in a dead end. However, the layout of the room, specifically the alignment of the eastern wall, should give players a hint that this is not a true dead end. Players can see just a hint that the room continues to the east. In one of the more memorable moments of the game, the solution to moving forward is to shoot an arrow into the eye of an Igor statue at the dead end. Once the statue is shot, the wall moves back to reveal a staircase. The bottom of the stairs is boxed in by the bouncing pegs, preventing Link from moving forward if he does not have the hammer. Using the hammer, Link can progress to the second half of the dungeon, which is more straightforward. Players have to manipulate a crystal switch to reach a locked door. But once through that door, players have to follow a single path through 3 rooms to reach a teleporter. The teleporter transports the player on a straight path which leads straight to the boss door. The boss here is the Helmasaur King. It's a large, orange, quadrupedal creature wearing a blue mask. The Helmasaur King spits fireballs, which further divide and then fly in multiple directions. It also has a long tail that it can swing at the player. The mask must be broken off before its weak spot is revealed. Players can damage the mask with the hammer or with bombs. Interestingly, in an interview on Glitterberry's Game Translations, Shigeru Miyamoto said, "Originally we had it so that the hammer didn't do anything. But because we went through the trouble of putting the hammer in the temple, we went back and reprogrammed it so it could be put to use as well. Once enough damage is done, the mask falls away, and players can land blows on a green crystal on the monster's head. Once it falls, the player is awarded a heart container. A crystal containing the captured Maiden then appears. She thanks Link, providing more details on Ganon and the Dark World. She explains the Dark World was changed into its current form by a wish from Ganon. She believes Ganon intends to conquer the Light World. But she says with the power of the 7 Maidens, Link can break through the barrier on Ganon's tower. She then reveals the location of the remaining dungeons on the world map. From here on out, players can actually tackle the dungeons in a variety of orders. However, for the purposes of this podcast, I'll be sticking to the numerical order outlined by the game. It's also interesting to note the way the Maiden's speech is displayed in the different versions. In the SNES version, it scrolls, while in the Game Boy Advance version, it erases before new text fills in. Magic is a returning element in A Link to the Past from Zelda 2. Both games feature a magic meter, though how magic is handled in each game is ultimately different. While spells were learned from various old men throughout the adventure of Link and were selected from a menu, in A Link to the Past, magic is used through items. We've already seen this in action. For example, the lantern uses magic, as does magic powder. The game also contains 3 spells which can only be used after Link acquires an associated medallion. 2 of the medallions are required to complete the game. 1 is optional. I picked up the optional medallion here. It's found in the Desert of Mystery in the Light World, but the location can only be reached from the Dark World. South and west of the Dark Palace there is a bridge across the river. In the Light World, it's a stone man-made bridge. Here in the Dark World, it's a natural bridge. What's unnatural are the purple pegs sticking out of the ground, blocking Link from crossing. However, with the hammer, Link can knock down the pegs and continue south and west to the marsh. A sign near the Dark World equivalent of the Desert of Mystery informs us that it is the Swamp of Evil. We are told there is no way in or out, and that proves to be true, at least for now. At the dead end, purple pegs outline the shape of a rock formation found in the Light World. Standing within the pegs and using the mirror allows Link to get on top of the otherwise inaccessible ledge. A stone tablet can be translated with the Book of Medora, and the Bombos Medallion is awarded. This sends out a flame attack in all directions and lights enemies within range on fire. We'll get some use out of this in the next dungeon. Let's get to that dungeon. While it is named the Swamp Palace, it's actually located in the marshlands adjacent to the Swamp of Evil, or the Desert of Mystery in the Light World. There's a small building located near the southwestern corner of the marsh. This is the Swamp Palace. It appears small from the outside because most of the structure is underground. The Swamp Palace is the first water-themed dungeon in the series. These dungeons have since become considered a staple of Zelda games, and they're often among the dungeons that most frustrate players. A major focus of many water-themed dungeons in Zelda games is changing water levels. And this is the first time in the series that that mechanic has come into play, and it does so right off the bat. Upon entering the dungeon, players run into a dead end. A ladder leading to a path that will take players deeper into the dungeon is out of reach. A staircase leads to a hint tile. Sahasrahla tells Link that actions taken in either the Light World or the Dark World will affect their mirrored location in the other world. The solution is to first exit the dungeon, then to use the mirror to go back to the Light World. The Light World equivalent of this building is sort of a spillway control building. Players can pull a switch to release some dammed up water. Outside, the water that surrounded the building is gone. Players will find a piece of heart to grab in the remains of the exterior pond. Traveling back to the Dark World, players can now enter the Swamp Palace to find that the room is now flooded, giving access to that otherwise unreachable ladder. This sort of interplay between the Light World and the Dark World to influence dungeons or locations isn't really utilized further in the game. Most of the interaction between the worlds will involve using changes in elevation to reach otherwise inaccessible areas, like we saw when collecting the Bombos Medallion. As with most of the dungeons in this game, the Swamp Palace is separated into 2 distinct sections. The first section primarily takes place in a cross-shaped section of the dungeon. As with the Desert Palace and the Dark Palace before it, the 2 sections are separated by an item lock. The second section cannot be accessed until the dungeon item is acquired. Players start in the eastern arm of the cross. The dungeon map is hidden behind a bombable wall not far from the stairs. From the location of the map, players will be able to see a skull on the lower level. Once players make their way to this lower level, they will find another unreachable ladder and a locked door next to it. The skull seen earlier holds a small key used to open the door. In an adjacent room, there is a switch that, when flipped, causes the water to flow, flooding the lower level and allowing players to progress to the middle of the cross. The central room of the cross is large. It holds the big chest and a number of raised platforms. Some have stairs allowing Link to reach the upper level. Others are seemingly out of reach, at least until we acquire the dungeon item. The southern arm of the cross is a loop where players will find the compass. The western arm will have players advancing to get a key near a dead end and then returning to a locked door to access a switch which changes the water level, allowing them to pass. This arm of the cross also features a bit of trickery involving a crystal switch. Players will have to use the crystal switch to lower a set of blue blocks to access the water level switch. After toggling that switch, it appears that players can go through this door and over a set of now lowered blue blocks to quickly reach the room that players need to go to next. But leaving the blocks down will mean that players will later run into a wall of pink blocks, preventing access to the big key. So players will either need to backtrack, as I did, to reset the crystal switch to its original position and then take the long way around to get to the big key, or they will need to have the prior knowledge to immediately reset the switch after raising the water level. The big key is reached by dropping down a hole in an upper level of the dungeon. With the big key in hand, Link can return to the central room and open the big chest. It contains the Hookshot. This now classic Zelda item makes its first appearance here. It's a grappling hook, which can latch onto a number of different objects, and then pull players to that object. We need the Hookshot to access the second section of the dungeon. That section is reached by first using the Hookshot to grab a small key from an otherwise inaccessible ledge, and then using it to reach an otherwise inaccessible door. While previous dungeons have featured straightforward second sections that are more like gauntlets with no room to deviate from the main path, this time the game changes things up. The first section was the more straightforward of the two in this dungeon. Entering the second section, players are immediately met with a forking path. There are 3 doors that players can travel to, 2 side by side on the east, and a third further apart on the west. If players take the door to the west, they will find a switch to change the water level, but they won't be able to activate it. The correct path sees players taking the middle door. The eastmost door leads to optional treasure chests, which can only be reached with the water at the correct level. This dungeon also features a hidden door behind a waterfall. I honestly don't know how I knew to walk through it. I could recall there was an entrance behind a waterfall as soon as I reached the room that contained it, and I walked through the correct waterfall out of pure force of habit. I'm not sure how I found it the first time. If you don't know, there is a door hidden in the second to last waterfall. The layout of the room may offer some small hints to this. On the side where we enter, there is a visible door with one waterfall to the west of it. Players may be able to deduce that the doors are mirrored on either side, and then walk through the waterfall that way. I mentioned the Bombos Medallion comes in handy in this dungeon. I really only used it once, in the room just before the boss fight. It's a flooded room with enemies floating on water. Players need to jump in, swim east, grab a key, then swim west to reach the locked door that leads to the boss. I find it easiest just to use the Bombos Medallion to defeat all the enemies before starting to swim. That way you don't take damage. The boss of the dungeon is Argus, a large jellyfish with a massive eye. Argus starts the fight surrounded by a number of puffballs, which it uses for both defense and attack. Argus can't be damaged until these puffballs are destroyed. Players have to use the Hookshot to pull them off, then slash them with the sword to destroy them. Once all the puffballs are gone, Argus begins leaping around the room, attempting to land on the player. It's not difficult to avoid, however. The boss will fall in a few slashes from the sword, awarding players with a heart container and freeing the second Maiden. The Maiden tells Link that the Dark World was twisted into its current shape through the influence of Ganon. She also mentions his non-beast name for the first time in series history, calling him Ganondorf the Thief, and then later correcting herself to say that he is now Ganon. The Maiden also tells Link there are other warp points like the one found on top of Death Mountain. That information will be essential for later in the game. Much like the original game, players can take on most of the Dark World dungeons out of sequence. Prior to this podcast, when playing through A Link to the Past, I would put Skull Woods off until later in the playthrough, saving it at least until after Dungeon 4, Thieves Town. That's mostly because I remember Skull Woods as being a particularly challenging dungeon on my first playthrough. And for first-time players playing it through today, however, I can see that Skull Woods is not as complex as it first appears. There is, however, a much greater number of optional rooms in this dungeon compared to all others. Skull Woods contains a clear horror theme. Where the Light World's Lost Woods had tunnels made from hollowed-out logs, these Skull Woods have tunnels shaped like giant, snake-like rib cages. True to its name, there are also many skulls. Many are submerged in the ground so that only the eyes are visible. A few stick fully out of the ground and have monstrous, gaping, open mouths that serve as doors to the dungeon proper. Inside the dungeon, the walls are covered with thick vines, and there are skeletal relief sculptures carved into them. Among the enemies players will face are the skeletal Stalfos. These we've faced multiple times already. There are also mummy enemies called Gibdo, and giant hands known as Wallmasters. Both the Gibdo and the Wallmaster originate from the original game and make their first appearance here. The Wallmaster behaves differently in this game compared to the first. True to their name, in the first game they emerged from the wall. This time they drop from the ceiling. In both the original game and A Link to the Past, the Gibdo are a tougher than average enemy. Here they have an added weakness to fire. A single hit from the fire rod can defeat a Gibdo. On paper, Skull Woods does not look terribly complex. The dungeon map reveals only 2 basement level floors. The second basement level features only a single room. The first floor maps out into sort of an L shape, but it's clear from the map that the 2 portions of this floor are not directly connected. This dungeon must be navigated by traveling back and forth between the forest in the overworld and the dungeon below. It is a large expansion of the concept introduced in the Desert Palace, where players needed to leave the palace in order to re-enter and complete it. This, however, is much more complex as there are many more entrances and some are hidden. The woods themselves are also laid out like a maze. If players enter the forest from the northern entrance, they will find only dead ends. Players must enter from the south. In addition to the skull doors I mentioned, there are also holes hidden under bushes that serve as entrances to the dungeon. The first skull door leads directly to a room containing the big chest. There is no visible way to reach it, however, and players will not have the big key. The room adjacent to this one contains the map, and star switches that move the location of holes on the ground. Players will not be able to progress past this room because of the holes. Players have to exit the dungeon, head north through a ribcage tunnel, and then south to reach a second skull door. This leads to a room with a floor switch that must be held down by a statue. Players must drag the statue into place while avoiding a Wallmaster. In the now open room on the north, players will acquire the big key. Then it's back to the area of the first skull door. But instead of entering the door, players must cut away at a 3x3 grid of bushes to reveal a hole in the ground. The hole drops players to the other side of the map room. There they will find a bombable wall, which leads to a room with a switch. After changing the location of the holes on the floor, players will open the path to the big chest. Inside is the fire rod. This rod flings fireballs, allowing Link to light torches and burn foes. Skull Woods is another example of a dungeon that requires an item to reach the second section. Requiring an item to complete a dungeon was a rarity in the first 2 games, but with A Link to the Past we can see this is becoming more common. To reach the second section of Skull Woods, players need to return to the entrance where they found the big key and then west, eventually finding an exit to the south. I missed it on my first playthrough for this podcast, but there is a small key under a skull in this room. Grabbing it will make this second section easier. After exiting, players head north through a ribcage tunnel to find a structure that looks like a massive, monstrous face. It has horns and tusks, maybe? Its eyes are closed, and there's a large centipede sticking out of its mouth. Using the fire rod, players burn the centipede away. The eyes at the structure open, staring at the player, daring them to go in. At least on the Super Nintendo version. On the Game Boy version, the eyes were off-screen for me, so the creepy way they open was undercut. It may even go unnoticed. Upon entering, players will find a long bridge over a room that leads to a locked door. If you already have a key in your pocket, just cross the bridge and go through the door. If players don't have a key, they have to head down the stairs and navigate a sort of maze underneath the bridge. Players will need to dart back and forth while dodging an electric ball enemy. Then they need to get a key in an adjacent room that contains spike traps and enemies before backtracking to open the door. The next room also stands out. It features a series of star switches that players will have to activate to move holes. Players crisscross the room, hitting a switch, then moving to the next, to eventually reach a door on the eastern wall. In the next room, the fire rod comes in handy. It's packed with Gibdo and has 5 torches that need to be lit to open the door. In the following room, players slash their way through vines to reveal a hidden entrance, bringing back a concept that players first saw in Hyrule Castle Tower before facing Agahnim. It's not much further until players come to the boss room entrance. This one is different from any that we've come across yet. Instead of a door, it's just a hole in the floor. Falling through the hole leads to the boss, Mothula. As its name implies, it is a giant moth. There is a lot going on in this fight. Mothula flies around the room, occasionally shooting out beams in 3 directions. The floor is a massive conveyor belt. The walls are lined with spike traps, and occasionally the traps move and switch walls. There is so much going on in this fight that on the SNES the frame rate drops, causing the game to chug. I didn't notice any slowdown on my Game Boy Advance playthrough. I found it easiest just to stick close to Mothula and hit it with spin attacks. The fire rod is particularly effective, but while playing on the SNES version I found it easier just to use the sword. I managed to get through the fight without dying in that way. When I attempted to use the fire rod on my SNES playthrough, I died. But on my Game Boy Advance playthrough, I used the fire rod more extensively. Once Mothula is defeated, players are again awarded with a heart container, and the third Maiden is freed. This Maiden tells of the prophecy of the Great Cataclysm. According to the Maiden, the prophecy states that if someone with an evil heart gets the Triforce, only someone from the bloodline of the Knights of Hyrule can defeat them. If the evil one defeats the hero, then there is nothing that can stop them. She says that Link is of the Knights of Hyrule bloodline. After completing Skull Woods, it's time to head south to the 4th dungeon. It's located in the Dark World equivalent of Kakariko Village, the Village of Outcasts. This village is full of bombed-out buildings. Of the few that are still standing, most are businesses. Ghosts drift across the landscape and monsters wander the streets. Signs posted around it read, "People without rupees are not welcome here." It quickly becomes clear why. Among the roving monsters and ghosts, there are also thieves wandering the streets. They attempt to run into Link and make off with his rupees. But turnabout is fair play. The thieves' stash of stolen rupees in homes is yours for the taking. On the southern end of the village is a small building with cracks in the wall. A bomb opens an entryway, leading to a small room with a chest and 300 rupees inside. Another standing building on the eastern side of the village is empty except for a chest containing another 300 rupees. Of the businesses in the village, only one is worth note. It's a gambling game which allows players to open 2 chests and keep whatever is inside. I largely ignored this game on playthroughs prior to making this podcast, but it may be worth taking the time to play. The big prize is a heart piece. I cheated and used the rewind feature on Switch SNES Online to get the heart piece on my first pick, and then I went to a chest that I had previously seen 100 rupees in. Instead, I got 10 arrows when I opened it. I messed around with a few more chests and got different results with each chest that I opened. It appears that the entire game is based on luck. It really doesn't matter which chest is open. Players after the heart piece, but not using the rewind, will have to hope they get lucky when they open the chest or pay until they do. So, where is the dungeon? After all, the map indicates there is one here. There is a building located on the north end of the village. It sits low to the ground with only the windows visible, suggesting a subterranean structure. It's in the same location as the former Thieves' hideout in Kakariko. A man inside that building told us that it was indeed a former hideout and told us about the leader of the thieves, Blind, who hated bright light. In the SNES version, he gives a suspicious look around after telling us this information. For some reason in the Game Boy Advance version, that detail was removed. Just south of this building, in the center of the village, sits a large gargoyle statue. It's in the same location as the weathercock in Kakariko. A talking tree on the southeastern corner of the village tells Link that a girl can be heard calling out from under the gargoyle statue. It's a hint that this is the entrance to the dungeon. The next question is, how do we get inside? I seem to recall I had a hard time figuring it out the first time I played this game. I don't recall how I came upon the solution. A friend and I were playing through the game at the same time and exchanging tips and solutions that we were discovering. So I don't know if that friend told me the solution or if I came upon it on my own or I discovered it elsewhere. The solution is actually pretty simple, and I think that's what tripped me up. All the player has to do is grab the bars blocking the entrance under the gargoyle and pull. The bars break away, allowing the players to enter the fourth dungeon, Thieves Town. This dungeon does not have the strong theming seen in the Swamp Palace or Skull Woods. It's all green stone and doesn't immediately distinguish itself from other dungeons. It does, however, have a gimmick which really helps it stand apart. As with most of the dungeons in this game, Thieves Town is divided into two sections. The first section takes place across 4 large rooms. The rooms feature a grid of crisscrossing bridges on the upper level, and a maze-like network of paths on the lower level. The first room of the dungeon contains both the dungeon map and the big key. The map is easily reached on the upper level. The big key is on the lower level, and is only accessible if players take a looping path through the lower levels of the first 4 rooms of the dungeon. First going north, then east, then south, then back west. The compass is found on the upper level of the southeastern room, while the big key door leading to the second section of the dungeon is located on the upper level of the northeastern room. Through that door, it's a straight shot to the boss room. The door is even open. When players go inside, they will find an empty room. Just outside the boss door is a small key hidden under a skull. A locked door is on the southwestern wall of the hallway. Traveling west through a few rooms, players will then head north and can go up to an upper level. A hint tile on the upper level contains a warning from Princess Zelda, not to be deceived by the magic of Blind the Thief. While on the upper level, players will notice light coming through the windows. We are inside the visible portion of the structure seen topside in the Village of Outcasts. In the westernmost room, a stream of light falls directly on a cracked floor above the boss room. A low wall keeps players from walking up to the cracked floor. A chest in the room contains bombs, and the item text helpfully reminds players they can pick up and throw bombs. Throwing a bomb onto the floor allows light to stream into the boss room below. Backtracking, players can flip a crystal switch upon returning to the lower floor. This allows players to head a couple rooms east and then descend to the lowest level of the dungeon. There is a forking path. A door to the south is blocked by a massive stone block. Prior to this podcast, I always assumed, due to its size and appearance, that it could not be lifted. It turns out that you can, so players can head either directly south or take a looping path through a door on the west, which will take them south and then east. Either way, players will reach a room with a series of locked jail cells. In the cell furthest back, Link finds a girl. She thanks him for rescuing her, and then asks to be taken out of the dungeon. This situation should raise some red flags for players. The other maidens were not in cells. We also have a warning from Zelda. There is a small key inside a chest inside the jail cell with the girl. The dungeon item is found to the west. It's possible to complete this dungeon without obtaining the item, but the game can't be completed without it. Players will have seen the locked room, which holds the big chest, if they took the looping path to reach the jail cells. I skipped that path on my Game Boy Advance playthrough, and I wound up having to double back because I forgot to go open the big chest. The item is the Titan's Mitt. This is an upgrade to the Power Glove, allowing players to lift dark-colored stones. If players attempt to exit the dungeon through the front entrance with the girl in tow, she will ask players not to go that way, and will refuse to exit. The solution is to head back to the boss room. A square of light is now at the center of the room. Leading the girl into the light will cause her to scream that it's too bright, and she will transform into the monstrous Blind the Thief. Blind is a ghost-like being with a white sheet-like body and a red head and hands. Blind fires lasers at the player, can deal damage by landing blows to its head. After enough damage is dealt, Blind's body collapses into a heap, and heads begin flying around freely. After a few moments, the body raises again with a new head, while the old head continues to fly around and fire at the player. Echoes of Gleeok from the first game are felt here. At the end of the fight, 2 heads will be flying. After enough damage is dealt to the third incarnation of Blind, his body explodes, leaving behind a heart container. Once collected, the 4th Maiden is freed. The newly freed Maiden doesn't offer much new, just reinforcing the fact that Link is a descendant of the Knights of Hyrule, the last of the Knights line in fact, and the only one who can defeat Ganon, according to prophecy. After acquiring Titan's Mitt from Thieves Town, there are a few places we can't go in Hyrule. That means there are a number of side quests and optional items that players can now obtain. I tackled a few side quests at this point in the game, and I didn't have to travel far from the village of outcasts to do it. On the southern end of the village, near where the library is in the light world, dark stone skulls encircle a frog. We can now lift these skulls and other dark-colored stones. As with many of the strange characters that we meet in the Dark World, this is another Light World resident who somehow got stuck in the Dark World. He tells us he used to live in Kakariko. He says his partner must miss him. This should trigger a memory of a past hint we found in the village. A blacksmith is on the eastern outskirts of the village. The smith said he could temper Link's sword if his lost partner ever returns. Using the mirror, we travel back to the Light World and then to the blacksmith's. Once the 2 smithies are reunited, they make good on their offer to temper Link's sword. They will have to take the sword for a while to do it, however. Without the sword, it's a good idea not to stray too far from Kakariko Village. Luckily, just outside the blacksmith shop is a wooden peg that can be knocked down with a hammer. With the peg out of the way, Link can fall down a hole where he finds a strange statue. It depicts 2 dragons encircling a pair of giant hands holding a red gem. Putting magic powder on this statue causes a bat creature to appear. Many sources refer to this character as the Mad Batter. However, the Link's Awakening remake on Nintendo Switch refers to this character as Lil Devil. If the latter's a more accurate translation to the original Japanese, I don't know. The bat grumps at Link for waking him up, sarcastically thanking him. It then, somewhat reluctantly, tells Link it will curse him and fires a bolt of lightning right at him. The curse actually turns out to be a good thing. From here on out, Link's magic spells cost half as much as usual. Nice! A quick trip to Kakariko proper and then back to the smithy allows Link to reclaim his sword. The tempered Master Sword hits harder than the standard blade, which comes in handy as we head into these later dungeons. After getting the sword, it's back to the Dark World. A bombed-out building stands in place of the blacksmith's shop in the Village of Outcasts. Inside is an unusual chest. It's blue in color. When Link approaches it, a message says a key is locked inside the chest, so it can never be opened. Link takes the chest with him. Earlier in the game, just outside the Desert of Mystery, Link encountered a man who sat silently next to a sign. The sign urges everyone who reads it to ignore the average middle-aged man. Elsewhere, a thief told Link an ex-member of their gang was staying at the entrance to the desert. When Link approaches the middle-aged man with the chest in tow, he speaks. He says he heard that Link knows he used to be a thief. He offers to open the chest in exchange for Link's silence about his past. If you promise not to tell, the chest is opened, and Link is given the magic bottle that was inside. Now to the Ice Palace. The frozen dungeon sits in the center of the Dark World equivalent of Lake Hylia. A wall surrounds the structure, and the wall has no gates or doors, meaning there's no way to enter the dungeon, at least not from the Dark World. If a player travels to the Light World, they can make their way in. Outside the Pond of Happiness, there's a dark-colored stone, which can be lifted with the Titan's Mitt. Under the rock is a portal to the Dark World. Walking through it, it transports Link inside the outer walls of the Ice Palace, and from there, he can go inside. The dungeon lives up to its name. It features a distinct ice-covered appearance, and in some rooms, slippery ice-covered floors. These floors are a brighter blue and have a grid pattern on them in contrast to the other floors of the dungeon. The Ice Palace is easily the most difficult and complex dungeon to this point. It spans 8 floors, 1 at ground level and 7 basement level floors. The 7th basement level is the boss room. This dungeon really relies on players being able to remember specific locations and navigate to them in order to solve the dungeon's puzzles. There are many individual rooms that did not strike me enough to write them down as a standout, but frankly, players will have to know them and have to have some knowledge of the layout to be successful here. It's also worth noting that the Ice Palace is not separated into 2 distinct sections, as the other dungeons in the game are. There is a big key door inside this dungeon, but players still have to backtrack into past areas even after passing through this door. The dungeon features sort of a vertical looping design that sees players descending the tower and then ascending again multiple times in order to advance. Players first descend down to basement level 4, then back up to basement level 1 to get the big key. Players go back down, descending to basement level 5 where the big chest is found. It contains blue mail. This is a defense upgrade. Link takes less damage while wearing it. It's also completely optional. To the east of the big chest room, there is a big key door, and the most infamous puzzle in the game. This also marks one of the biggest changes between the Game Boy Advance and the SNES versions of the game. Let's take a look at the SNES version first. The puzzle plays out between 2 floors, basement level 5 and basement level 6. On basement level 5, there is a hole in the center of the room with pushable blocks on either side. A blue crystal switch barrier prevents players from reaching the blocks. The room immediately below this room contains a floor switch, which does not stay pressed when Link steps on it. There isn't anything in the room to hold the switch down. Players need to push a block from the floor above through the hole and then push that block onto the switch. The trick is only the blocks on the left side of the hole can actually be pushed onto the switch. The crystal switch needed to lower the blue barrier above is found in a room east of the floor switch. But because of the newly raised pink barriers, players are forced to loop back up to basement level 4 and then to drop back down to the big chest room to reach the blocks that we need to push in order to advance. Link pushes a block down and then follows it through the hole. Pushing a block onto the switch allows Link to move through a door to the south where the entrance to the boss room is found. It is worth noting that this puzzle can be completely bypassed if players tackle the 6th dungeon, Misery Mire, before the Ice Palace. I'll talk about that in more detail later in the episode. In the Game Boy Advance version, this puzzle was completely redesigned to make it much easier and ultimately less flexible. There's no bypassing this puzzle on Game Boy Advance. The hole in the big key door is now covered with a large square block, which must be lifted with the Power Glove or Titan's Mitt. A barrier of blue blocks prevents players from lifting this block. On basement level 6, players are prevented from reaching the door forward by a row of push blocks, which are lined with a row of pegs. The crystal switch is found in the same place. A newly raised pink barrier forces players to take the same looping path up to basement level 4 and then down again to basement level 5. We lift the massive block and drop down the hole to land on the other side of the push block and peg barrier. From there, players can continue forward to the dungeon boss. The boss is called Cold Stare. It's a pink cloud with a large eye locked inside a giant block of ice. The ice must be melted. I used the fire rod, but I understand the Bombos Medallion may also work. I didn't try it myself. Once the ice is gone, the eye in the center multiplies, becoming 3. It takes a few hits from the sword to take each eye down. I didn't find the fight to be too difficult. Once Cold Stare is no more, Link receives a heart container and the 5th Maiden is freed. The Maiden mentions that once Ganon is defeated, the Dark World will disappear and the Triforce will await for a new holder. So far in A Link to the Past, we've managed to rescue 5 of the 7 captured Maidens. Our map has been helpful in locating them, and we were able to reach each dungeon without too much trouble. That changes with the 6th dungeon. The map shows its location is in the Swamp of Evil. You'll recall earlier in the episode I mentioned a sign near the swamp warns that there's no way in or out, and that appears to be true from the Dark World. In the past, however, we've been able to get around these Dark World blocks by entering from the Light World. But here's the thing, there's no location within the Desert of Mystery, the Light World equivalent of the Swamp of Evil, that Link can reach that will give him access to a Dark World portal. Link needs a new way to travel. That brings us to one of the most famous quests in the game. It involves the Flute Boy and his musical mystery. Many players refer to this as a side quest, but it is in fact required to complete the game. To the southeast of Kakariko Village there lies a mysterious grove of trees. Music can be heard coming from inside. A boy clad in green can be seen sitting on a tree stump, playing a lively tune on an ocarina. A group of forest creatures surround him, transfixed by the tune. But try to draw close and the boy disappears, and the animals scatter. In Kakariko Village, there's an old man dozing in the southern portion of the bar. When Link speaks to him, he mentions his son really liked to play the flute. But his son went looking for the golden power and never returned. The man wonders where he is now. Traveling to the Dark World, Link finds a creature with a long nose in the equivalent location of the flute-playing apparition. The creature explains he was transformed into the shape after entering from the Light World. He then confirms he's the missing Flute Boy. He says he buried his flute with some flower seeds in the Light World before leaving. He gives Link a shovel and requests the flute be recovered for him. Using the mirror, Link returns to the Light World and finds the flute in the northwestern corner of the grove. It's notable that the shovel handles differently in the Game Boy Advance version. In the original game, players can only dig to the left or right of Link. But in the remaster, players can also dig to the front or behind him. Back in the Dark World, the Flute Boy discovers that he cannot play in his current shape. He also tells Link that his mind is going. He asks Link to play for him. As he listens to the tune, he transforms into a tree, effectively dying. Just before his transformation, the Flute Boy asks Link to give his flute to his father in Kakariko. Traveling back to the Light World and entering the bar, the boy's father perks up upon hearing the flute music. He asks Link how his son is, but quickly realizes that he met a sad fate. The father asks Link to keep the flute and to play it for the bird in the village square. He's referring to the weathercock. Playing the flute to the weathercock causes it to break, revealing a small white bird. This unlocks the game's secondary fast travel system. Playing the flute in the Light World allows Link to travel between 8 fast travel locations on the world map. In the Game Boy Advance version, there is a 9th point that will be added on later. It is also worth noting that we keep the shovel in the GBA version. It was replaced by the flute in the SNES version. The item menu on the Game Boy Advance is wider, with all 4 of Link's bottles displayed on the right side. On the SNES, all 4 were only visible within a sub-menu. With the bottles moved, both the shovel and the flute can now fit on the left side of the menu. We play the flute and travel to the 6th fast travel point. The bird drops us off onto an otherwise unreachable ledge in the Desert of Mystery. A portal to the Dark World is found under a dark-colored stone on that ledge. Players cannot enter the Swamp of Evil without the flute and the Titan's Mitt. It is hard-locked, meaning an item is required. Once in the swamp, however, players attempting to access the dungeon, Misery Mire, will run into a second hard lock, preventing them from entering. The entrance to the dungeon is closed, and the symbol of a magic medallion is visible. We have not collected this medallion yet in this playthrough. The medallion is found on top of Death Mountain in the Light World, just west of the Tower of Hera. Players use the Book of Medora to translate a tablet, and they receive the Ether Medallion. This medallion can be collected at any point after players acquire the Master Sword, but it's not required until this point of the game. The Ether Medallion is another screen-clearing attack. It sends out a wave of cold air in all directions. Many enemies die upon being hit. Particularly tough enemies will freeze. The medallion can also be used to briefly reveal invisible paths. Before heading into the dungeon, I want to talk about a couple of side quests that I knocked out in this portion of the game as well. Before heading to Death Mountain, I collected a magic cape. This is an optional item that turns Link invisible and allows him to bypass some obstacles. That includes bumpers and spiked floors. Again, the item is technically optional, but it comes in handy later in the game. The cape is located in the Light World graveyard. A gravestone in the northeastern corner has 2 dark-colored stones blocking it. Accessing it directly from the Light World requires the Titan's Mitt. Players can access it prior to getting the Titan's Mitt by traveling to the graveyard in the Dark World and cutting through a bush to enter the equivalent spot, then using the Mire to travel back to the Light World. A dash with the Pegasus boots opens the grave, revealing a cave with the cape inside for the taking. On top of Death Mountain, after taking a portal to the Dark World near Spectacle Rock, Link can jump to a lower ledge to find a cave. These jumps are more difficult to make in the Game Boy Advance version. Players have to jump blindly due to the reduced vertical viewing space. I skipped this item on the GBA, but inside the cave on Death Mountain, Link finds the Cane of Burna. This is another optional item, which creates a force field around Link when used. The hammer and the Titan's Mitt are required to reach it. The magic cape and a health-restoring magic potion also comes in handy as players need to walk across a spiked floor. Now it's on to Misery Mire. It's raining inside the Swamp of Evil. A Dark World resident in a cave within the swamp tells us the rain is caused by monsters. It will stop if the wind is properly stirred up. As mentioned earlier, the Ether Medallion symbol is visible on the entrance of the dungeon. Using the Ether spell, we send out a cold wind blast that stops the rain. The dungeon entrance then rises out of the swamp, allowing Link to enter. We've already passed 2 hard locks to get into the dungeon. First, getting the flute and the fast travel ability, then getting the Ether Medallion to open the entrance. And would you believe it if I told you there's a 3rd lock on this dungeon? Well, there is. In the very first room of the dungeon, there is a large hole directly in the player's path. Prior to this podcast, I believed it was a hard lock requiring the hookshot to enter. But after browsing a forum thread on zeldadungeon.net, I learned that players were able to use the Pegasus boots to ram a block and bounce over the hole. That means this is a soft lock. Players can tackle Misery Mire before taking on Swamp Palace. The bouncing technique is also required to reach a room in Ganon's tower. It took me multiple tries to maneuver Link just right to bounce across the hole in my SNES playthrough. A YouTube commenter on my original episode pointed out that you can change direction after starting a dash, which makes getting across much easier. Knowing that, I was able to enter this dungeon using the bouncing method with no problem on my Game Boy Advance playthrough. Misery Mire spans only 3 floors. After the 8-floor behemoth that was Ice Palace, it may seem like a 3-4 dungeon should be simple. But when revisiting this game for this podcast, I found it to be much more confusing than the Ice Palace, at least at first. The 2nd floor is a sprawling collection of rooms of various sizes. This dungeon is a true labyrinth, with crisscrossing paths that span multiple levels. I felt lost for a good while longer than I did in the Ice Palace, because it seemed every room I entered had multiple exits, and each room I passed through revealed just more rooms. However, it does all start to make sense. This dungeon doesn't have a particularly strong mechanical or gameplay theme to it. Visually, it is distinct. Misery Mire is made of green stone, and some walls are marked with green slime. It features unique wooden bridges, and a room with a latticework floor over a dark void that isn't seen in any other dungeon. Notably, in the Game Boy Advance version, players can see the floor below through the latticework. I assume some technical issue prevented them from doing this on SNES. The dungeon features a large central room. The lower level of the room is a maze of pathways. The upper level features doors around the other edge and a chain link walkway, but barriers limit free movement across the upper level. Players are required to loop in and out of the central room from different directions to reach the upper level doors and chests. 2 immediately accessible doors on the upper level lead to the room with the big chest. It can only be reached by using the hookshot to get over a gap and then dashing across a bridge before it collapses under Link's feet. However, we don't have the big key, meaning players need to first head down to the lower level and then make their way north to return to the upper level and advance through a door. The door leads to a room with 3 forking paths. Paths to the north and east lead to small keys. Players will also find the map to the east, but a chest isn't accessible until a blue crystal switch barrier is lowered. A door to the north on the eastern room will eventually take players back west to a large room, split in half by a blue block obstruction. A crystal switch is found in that room. After dropping the blocks, it's quickest to head south. There are spiked floors which are best bypassed by using the magic cape. Alternatively, players can backtrack to get around the spikes, or simply tank the damage. After bypassing the spikes, we duck back into the central room for a key, and then through a door on the southwest, eventually leading players back up to the first floor. This section is the biggest standout of the dungeon. There are 3 rooms. The first 2 rooms are mirrors of each other. Torches are located behind obstacles. The third room is very narrow. A hint tile reveals that all 4 torches must be lit to open the path forward. In the first room, blocks can be moved to access the torches. In the second room, the fire rod can light the torches from afar. Once all the torches are lit, the room shakes, and shakes, and shakes. Once the shaking stops, we find the third room has grown significantly. A hole is visible in the southeast corner. In the SNES version, it's black, which usually indicates that it's not a hole to fall into. But it is the only hole in the room, and the hint tile says that this is the way forward. In the Game Boy Advance version, again the lower floor is visible below, making the fall less nerve-wracking. Dropping down the hole, we find the chest with the big key. We then backtrack to the big chest room and cross the collapsing bridge to open the chest. Inside is the Cane of Somaria. All the text tells us is that this cane will be helpful if we make proper use of it. What a mysterious cane. The cane makes blocks. They can be used to hold down switches. After a block is placed, a second press of the button causes the block to burst in an attack that travels in 4 directions. We'll find another use for it in the next dungeon as well. After getting the cane, it's time to head north and then to the lower level to pass through the big key door on the lowest level of the dungeon. We first put the cane to use in a dark room with a switch that needs to be pressed. The block behaves differently when pushed in the Game Boy Advance version. There's a much greater range of motion and kind of a delay even, which threw me off. I don't feel like it's an improvement. It was much easier to move the block around in the original version. We passed through a few more dark rooms, finding and hitting crystal switches to advance, eventually returning to the light and to basement floor 1, where it's just a short walk to the boss room. The boss is called Vitreous. It's a giant eye sitting in a pool of slime, with smaller softball-sized eyes around it. These small eyes fly towards Link and must be destroyed. The large eye shoots lightning down the center of the screen. When all but 4 of the small eyes have been destroyed, the giant eye begins bouncing towards Link in an attempt to hit him. It takes several hits to defeat it, but once Vitreous falls, Link is awarded with a heart container and the 6th Maiden is freed. The Maiden explains that Ganon is unable to return to the Light World on his own, which is why he used Agahnim to kidnap the Maidens. She tells us that Princess Zelda is waiting in the 7th Dark World dungeon, Turtle Rock. Players who travel to Turtle Rock right away will see that it has the image of a magic medallion on it, specifically the Quake medallion. That means players will want to collect it before venturing up the mountain. The Quake medallion can be picked up at any time after Agahnim banishes Link to the Dark World. In my SNES playthrough, I picked it up after completing the Dark Palace. I didn't mention it because it made more sense to talk about getting it here. To find the medallion, players need to head to the Lake of Ill Omen. This is located in roughly the same location as Upper Zora River in the Light World. As players travel towards the lake, they will pass an item shop in place of the witch's hut. It's a good idea to use the Mire to travel back to the Light World and to visit the witch's hut to pick up a green or blue potion before heading to Turtle Rock. Blue is my preference. To the east of the Dark World shop, there is a large rock blocking a path alongside the river. Lifting this rock, players can continue north until they reach the lake. Unlike Zora's River, a large waterfall prevents players from moving further north. A sign warns against throwing things into a circle of stones, using reverse psychology to get players to do just that. Throwing the rock into the circle causes a massive catfish to jump out of it. It gives Link the Quake Medallion and asks Link not to bother it again. The Quake Medallion can be used to clear, or at least weaken, a screen full of ground-based enemies. It can also be used to open the dungeon. To reach Turtle Rock, I traveled to the Light World and fast-traveled to Death Mountain. I then ascended the mountain and went east. On the easternmost part of the mountain there is a hill with 3 wooden pegs on top. A dark rock blocks a staircase to the top of the hill. It's a hard lock preventing players from reaching Turtle Rock prior to completing Thieves Town. The pegs on top of the hill need to be hit in a specific order to reveal a Dark World portal. I didn't remember that order, so it took a little trial and error, but the eastern peg should be hit first, followed by the northern peg and then the western peg. Stepping into the portal, players are transported to the top of Turtle Rock, and yes, it is indeed shaped like a turtle, hence the name. A Quake Medallion symbol is located just behind the head. Using the medallion on that spot causes the head to disappear, revealing the entrance to the dungeon. I find Turtle Rock to be a significantly easier dungeon than either Misery Mire or the Ice Palace. It spans just 4 floors. There are optional rooms, and players may have to do a little trial and error to find their way forward, but there is a generally looping structure to the dungeon with paths that bring players back to a point where they can quickly try another path if needed. Visually, the dungeon is themed with a reddish stone look that's much like the various caves scattered throughout the game, though some rooms feature lava and large pipes providing some visual distinction. In the first room, there's a hint tile telling Link that magic will be essential for this dungeon, urging Link to bring along a magic restoring potion. I went in with blue potion, so I was covered. The first room also contains a hard lock, preventing players from going deeper into the dungeon unless they have the right item. It's a track over a bottomless pit. The track looks a lot like a dotted line with a question mark symbol at the end. How mysterious. If only we had a mysterious item to use. Oh yeah, the Cane of Somaria text did tell us that this was a mysterious item. And sure enough, dropping a block onto the question mark results in it changing into a platform. Players can direct the platform forward on the track with the direction buttons. This is the first of 2 unique game mechanics featured only in Turtle Rock. After crossing the bottomless pit, we walk through a door to find a large square room. A large bottomless pit is in the center of the room with a dotted line track running around the outside. The track's divided into 4 smaller squares. Players are able to move across the lines which bisect the larger square. The room has 6 doors, reachable only by traveling along the track. There are 2 doors on the east wall, 2 on the north, 2 on the south. The first door on the east leads to a dead end, so we continue on to the second. It leads to another large square room with a Cane of Somaria track. The track winds around 4 torches in the center of the bottomless pit. Players must use the fire rod to light these torches before quickly moving through a newly opened door on the north. Players find themselves in a long octagonal room. It contains the dungeon map and a key. To reach them, players must avoid 2 long rolling spike traps. After getting the map and key, players backtrack to the second room and continue around the track. Players must travel south and head to a door west of the entrance room. Players will travel down a short hallway to find a chest with a compass inside. There are spikes along the outer edge of the room, and 2 fireball-spitting statues in the southern corner. The compass is inside a chest in the center, however there's an eye above the entrance of the room. It's closed when Link has his back to it, but when Link faces the eye, it shoots lasers at him. The exit to the room is also closed if the eye is open. The solution is to charge a spin attack with Link's back to the eye and then walk backwards out of the room. We take the track to the leftmost door on the north wall. We spend a key and come face to face with an enemy that vaguely resembles an alien version of the pokey cactuses from the Mario series. It bounces around the room and loses body segments with hits from Link's sword. Once it's defeated, it drops a key. The room to the north holds a pair of recognizable enemies from the Mario games, Chain Chomps, or as they are often referred to in the world of Zelda, Bow Wow. This is not the first time Mario and Zelda have crossed paths. Of course, Shigeru Miyamoto is the creator of Mario and the co-creator of Zelda. He and Zelda co-creator Takashi Tezuka designed Super Mario Bros. In tandem with the original Legend of Zelda. They also developed A Link to the Past alongside Super Mario World. Last episode, we discussed the appearance of fire bar obstacles. In an interview included in the Japanese Player's Guide, Tezuka explained that the fire bars were originally created for Zelda, but were moved to Super Mario when they thought it would be a better fit there. Tezuka and Miyamoto obviously changed their minds later and brought the fire bars back for this game. When it comes to the chain chomps, Tezuka is less clear on their origins, simply saying, "We had concept art for Bow Wow laying around for a while. We'd put it aside thinking we'd make use of it if we could, but someone discovered it and ended up using it for their own purposes." The chain chomps first appeared in Super Mario Bros. 3. The Guardian reports that they were inspired by an incident from Miyamoto's youth, where he was chased by a dog before it was yanked back by a chain. The Bow Wow room is difficult to complete without taking damage. Players have to flip a crystal switch so that they can access a push block and make a chest appear. Then flip the switch back to get a key from the chest and proceed through the locked door. Just past the Bow Wow room, there is a second unique mechanic of this dungeon introduced. A series of crisscrossing tubes cover 2 rooms in the middle of the floor. They transport Link from one area to another. The tubes are primarily used in the central room of the floor. Players are first presented with a pair of tubes side by side. The tube to the east leads to a room packed with baddies. Defeating a second bouncing alien cactus grants a key which leads to another tube, which exits onto a central platform in the room. A chest on the platform contains the big key. Players then loop back around to the side-by-side tubes and proceed through the west tube. It leads to a room to the south, where players reach a T-shaped room. A door to the east leads to a dead end with the big chest just out of reach. An exterior entrance clearly visible on the south wall. Heading west, Link comes to a room filled with laser-shooting eyes. A bomb placed on a cracked wall to the south allows players to exit the dungeon onto a narrow ledge. If players use the mirror just outside the door on the right side of the ledge, they'll be transported to an otherwise unreachable ledge in the light world. That gives them access to a cave. Inside the cave, players need to clear a room of enemies to gain access to a chest with a heart piece. Notably, the room features Goria enemies in the original SNES version, but Igor enemies in the GBA version. Traveling back to the Dark World, players must enter the big chest room and get the mirror's shield. This upgraded shield blocks additional projectiles from enemies, including lasers fired by the eyes. Continuing north, players will eventually travel down to the lowest level of the dungeon. Once on this level, players find themselves in a large, dark room with a complicated Cane of Somaria track. The goal is to navigate to a central platform to hit a floor switch. Players then need to navigate to a door on the southwest. To the south, players grab a key guarded by laser shooting eyes. They will find that they can bomb through a wall leading to an outdoor ledge. This seems to be there in order to help players create sort of a checkpoint should they die. Players also navigate a maze of crystal switches and use the Cane of Somaria one final time before facing the boss. The boss of the dungeon is called Trinexx. As its name suggests, it's a 3-headed monster. Each head represents one of 3 elements. The center head is made of stone, the head on the right is made of ice, the head on the left is fire. The stone head cannot be damaged at first. Players need to take out the other 2 heads to reveal a weak spot. It's a good idea to take out the ice head first because it can make the floor slippery. The fire rod does the trick. The fire head is taken out with the ice rod, marking the first required use of this item, which we acquired near the start of the game. After the heads to the left and right are defeated, Trinexx's body breaks apart, and the stone head becomes a snake-like creature with 3 large circular segments in the middle. This is the weak spot. It took only a few hits from my sword to defeat this final phase of the boss. Once Trinexx is dead, we get a heart container and Zelda is freed. She urges Link on to Ganon's Tower. Ganon's Tower is located just west of Turtle Rock atop Death Mountain. But before going there, there's a few last things we'll want to take care of before moving on to the final section of the game. By this point, players will likely have noticed a large crack on the wall on the Pyramid of Power at the center of the Dark World, but the standard blue bombs have no effect on it. There's also a chance that they've wandered into the equivalent of Link's house in the Dark World and discovered that it's a bomb shop. At first it only sells standard bombs, but there is space for something else. After making enough progress in the game, a super bomb appears for sale. I'm not sure what the exact triggers are, but according to the wiki on zeldadungeon.net, players need to complete both the Ice Palace and Misery Mire to make the bomb appear. It costs 100 rupees. The large red bomb follows Link and can be placed with the A button. It features an added pulsing effect on Game Boy Advance. The bomb will blow a hole in the wall of the Pyramid of Power. Inside is a second mysterious pond. Link can toss in his bow and arrow and sword to get upgrades. Instead of Venus, Queen of the Fairies, a cursed fairy appears. This one is extremely large and says that she's been cursed by Ganon's magic. For being honest about dropping the bow, players get upgraded to silver arrows. As with the original game, these are required to take out Ganon and to complete the game. Players can also get an upgraded sword. It's not required, but it will make Ganon's tower more manageable. In the Game Boy Advance version, returning to Ganon's tower is a breeze. A 9th fast travel point to the top of the mountain is added once Turtle Rock is accessed. In the SNES version, players have to scale the mountain again. After approaching the tower, the maidens use their power to open it. Ganon's tower spans 8 floors. There are 7 above-ground floors and 1 basement level. As with the Tower of Hera, players enter on the 2nd floor. Much of the dungeon will be an intense gauntlet of enemies and traps. The lower floors, however, contain a twisting maze of passages and optional rooms which first must be navigated. There are multiple paths through the lower floors. Players can take either a door on the west or the east. Depending on the door taken, players will face slightly different challenges. I took the door on the west. On the lower level, players will round up a big key, the dungeon map, and the dungeon item. Notably, the lower level features a maze of portals. Players will have to pass through multiple portals to find their way forward in the dungeon. The correct path involves taking first the portal on the east, then west, then a portal to the southwest. Players will have to navigate across a room filled with holes to take a portal to the northeast, which will then take them to a small enclosure with a single portal, which then allows players to reach the door. There are also invisible pathways in a few rooms in the dungeons. The first is found just beyond the portal maze. Some enemies that seem to float over a seemingly impassable hole give a hint about what's going on. A torch can be lit to reveal the invisible path. Players then need to move fast to get across it. If players already know what they're doing, they can strategically lift a skull across from the torch, which will allow them to hookshot to another skull, gaining quick access to the invisible path. Otherwise, they just have to run around. If the torch goes out before they've crossed the path, the Ether Medallion can be used to briefly reveal the path. Players can also place a Cane of Somaria block to help them cross the path without falling. Players will face 4 returning bosses within Ganon's tower. As I've highlighted throughout this podcast, repeated bosses are a common element of Zelda games. There hasn't been a game in my playthrough of the series yet that hasn't featured at least one repeated boss. The first repeated boss fight of A Link to the Past is found on the lowest floor of Ganon's tower. It's the Armos Knights. They fall to a single shot from the silver arrow. However, there is a twist that makes this fight slightly harder than the first time around. The floor is now covered in ice, making it slippery. Still, the Knights do not pose much of a challenge. The big key is found in a room north of the Knights. Moving up a floor, players will find the big chest, which contains the red mail. It reduces the damage that Link takes further. Placing the second defense upgrade in the final dungeon is an echo of getting the red ring in the original Legend of Zelda. Players are then looped around to the lower floor entrance. With the big key, players can then tackle the second segment of the dungeon, which involves ascending up the tower. The second segment is more or less a gauntlet of enemies and time challenges. Notably, the second room beyond the big key door features a row of cannons that shoot bubbles over a narrow bridge. Players have to cross it the best they can without getting hit. At the far end of the bridge, there's a pair of blocks, and a bombable wall just over a gap in the floor. Players must use the Pegasus shoes to bounce over the gap, much like we did when entering Misery Mire. I reached this room for the first time ever while making the 3rd season of this podcast. The room only holds a few fairies, but it feels good to be able to pull this move off. After passing through a series of enemy gauntlets, we reach a room that contains the second boss rematch. It's the Lanmolas from the Desert Palace. A block with a face on it spits fireballs at the player to add some extra challenge, but the fight's mostly the same as it was the first time. After passing through several more rooms, we have a rematch with Moldorm. The arena is wider and wing-shaped with notches cut out of the top and bottom, but the fight is much easier than the first time around. Moldorm fell in 2 hits for me. The hookshot is needed to grapple a chest which appears across a hole, allowing Link to exit the room. This chest notably appeared off-screen for me. One of the few times I noted in this game where something happened off-screen. It was something that I noted a lot while playing through the Oracle games. Let's get to the main boss of the tower now. It's another rematch fight from the first act of the game, Agahnim. This time the wizard creates 2 duplicates which shoot magic at Link. Tracking the real Agahnim is simple. His shadow is darker than either of the 2 duplicates. After a good old-fashioned match of Dead Man's Volley, Agahnim falls. When he does, the spirit of Ganon rises from his body, turns into a bat, and flies across the Dark World, then crashes through the roof of the Pyramid of Power. Link uses his flute and somehow summons the bird from the Light World to travel to the pyramid. Once there, players have a choice to either dive through the new hole on top of the pyramid and face Ganon right away, or take some time to recover, restock, even save. This respite before the final battle is a welcome change from the first 2 games where players were forced to battle through a difficult gauntlet of a dungeon and then take on the final boss right away. Not being thrown directly into the fight also allows players to take a breather and, more importantly, a chance to round up some necessary gear to take on Ganon if they haven't done so yet. So if for some reason the player does not yet have the silver arrows, they can take time now to get them. Not every game in the series offers a pause before the final boss, but a few will follow the lead of A Link to the Past. Before the fight, Ganon speaks with Link. He says, "I never imagined a boy like you could give me so much trouble. It's unbelievable that you defeated my alter ego, Agahnim the Dark Wizard, twice." That's right, it seems that Agahnim was just Ganon all along. And this translation holds between the SNES and the Game Boy Advance versions of the game. I was unable to find an official source that confirms this, but several commentators on online forums claim that the word used in the original Japanese text is really more like copy, suggesting that Agahnim is a lesser duplicate of Ganon, containing only part of his essence. If that is accurate, that would make this the first example of a concept that appears in multiple Zelda games. As we go through the series, we meet a number of Phantom Ganons, copies of the Dark Lord who commonly engage Link in a good old-fashioned match of Dead Man's Volley. Again, I wasn't able to find anything official to confirm that, and Clyde Mandolin at legendsoflocalization.com, when he did a playthrough of A Link to the Past comparing translations of the games, he just kind of accepted the alter ego translation with no commentary. The fight with Ganon himself plays out in 3 phases. He is armed with a trident this time. In the first phase, he will spin the trident around and then throw it. The trident eventually boomerangs back to him. After taking a few hits in this phase, Ganon begins to use fire attacks. The fire appears in the shape of a bat. There are a couple of variations on these fire bats. After a few hits, Ganon begins stomping the ground, causing the outer edge of the floor to fall away. Players can be knocked down to a lower floor, where they will be forced to exit the pyramid and start over again. The fight briefly pauses as Ganon announces he will use his special technique of darkness. 2 torches on the southern end of the battle arena extinguish. In a callback to the original game, when the torches go out, Ganon becomes invisible. Players need to relight the torches to make Ganon appear again, then land a hit on him with the sword. After Ganon is hit, he turns blue, and while blue, players must hit him with the silver arrow to deal damage, again echoing the first game. But this time, Ganon does not fall in a single hit. 4 arrows are required to defeat the Dark Lord. After Ganon falls, Link claims the Triforce and uses his wishes to restore things to how they were. The king lives again, as does Link's uncle. We see many happy endings all around, and the Master Sword, we are told, sleeps forever. That statement isn't true. We'll see as the series goes on, the Master Sword will be drawn and used in battle many times. Though at the time of this recording, only one of the sequels which feature the Master Sword is confirmed on Nintendo's official Zelda timeline to take place after A Link to the Past. The placement of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom is ambiguous, and where Echoes of Wisdom falls on that timeline is unclear at the time of this recording. In many ways, A Link to the Past is a pivot back to the design of the original Legend of Zelda. The game world is presented from a top-down perspective, with only one style of gameplay. There's no more switching between the overhead and side-scrolling views. In fact, A Link to the Past moves so far away from the side-scrolling dominated gameplay of Zelda 2 that it doesn't include any side-scrolling segments at all. And that's a change from the original game, where sub-levels of the dungeons were represented as screens viewed from the side. A Link to the Past, however, uses its increased graphical and computing power to stretch its dungeons into multi-floor affairs. It also significantly increases the size of the game world by presenting two different worlds, the Light World and the Dark World. The Light World lives up to its name. The world is vibrant, lush, and green. Unlike the first game where Hyrule lacked a sense of place, this game very much managed to make Hyrule seem like a fantasy kingdom. It lifts a page from Zelda 2 and features an actual village, a castle, palaces, residential structures for its characters, no more just living in caves. Hyrule Castle occupies the center of the map. Death Mountain lies to the north, Upper Zora River leading to Zora's waterfalls to the northeast. Lake Hylia occupies the southeastern corner of the map, with the Zora River running between the waterfall and the lake. The Eastern Palace and its associated ruins sit between the lake and the waterfall. The Desert of Mystery occupies the southwestern corner of the map, with a marshland between the desert and the lake. To the north of the desert, we find Kakariko Village. And to the north of Kakariko, occupying the northwestern section of the map, we find the Lost Woods. The Dark World also lives up to its name. The color palette is less vibrant. The grass is dead, the water a vile green. In place of rocks and pots, we find skulls. All Dark World residents are strange creatures. Many of the homes and structures are in poor shape. Those that stand are generally businesses. The layout of the Dark World is very similar to that of the Light World. The main differences being that the Pyramid of Power replaces the castle, the Lake of Ill Omen is in place of Upper Zora River, and the Swamp of Evil is in place of the desert. Other locations are roughly equivalent to their Light World locations. Unlike the first game, I would not describe this world as maze-like. The layout of the world flows well. There are still obstacles and walls that players have to navigate around, but in general, areas are more open, and the world feels a bit more natural. Using the extra power of the Super Nintendo, the design team managed to reduce the number of seams on the game world. Players no longer travel one screen at a time. Instead, the world's divided into about 6 regions. The camera will scroll with the player while in that region. There is a brief pause and a jogging transition as players move from one region to another, but the experience on the whole feels smooth and the seams are barely noticeable. In terms of structure and how the game unfolds, it's a hybrid of the structures of the first 2 games. A Link to the Past has a tighter structure than the first game, but it's not as tight as the second. During the game's introduction, players are limited to a fairly small area. Link's house is located between the castle and the marshland, and players will only be able to explore the areas immediately around Link's house and the castle. Once the introduction is complete, the world map opens significantly. Players will only be barred from Death Mountain, Upper Zora River, and Zora Waterfall, but all other areas are accessible. Now that doesn't mean that players can access every secret. They won't have all the necessary items to do that at this point. A few items like bombs, the power glove, and the hookshot are required to fully open the Light World. The world expands further with the introduction of the Dark World. The Dark World is laid out much the same as the Light World. There are more restrictions on how players can travel. Pegs keep players from accessing the marshlands until the hammer is acquired from the Dark Palace. Crossings at the river are limited until players acquire the hookshot. Players won't be able to access all Dark World portals until they get the Titan's Mitt. While players won't be able to bypass every roadblock or obtain every secret from the start of the game, they are still free to explore as they see fit after completing the introduction. If players run into a dead end, they just need to take a mental or physical note and then return later. That's basically how things played out in the first game as well. Players couldn't immediately travel to any location. Bombs, the candle, the raft, the ladder, the power bracelet, and whistle were all required to open every location on the map of the first game. Players were barred from some areas until those items were obtained. A Link to the Past is a much bigger game than the original, so the number of required items to reach every secret has also expanded, but the principle is the same. The real difference in structure in the game worlds of A Link to the Past and the original is through the use of soft locks, or locks that can be bypassed with the right knowledge or skill. In the original game, the Lost Woods and the Lost Hills served as soft locks on a large portion of the world. Players who learned how to progress through those soft locks could venture into later portions of the game prior to obtaining the ladder. but they still needed that ladder to tackle dungeons 5, 6, and 7. Zelda 2 featured no soft locks. All locked areas were behind a hard lock or a lock that required a certain item or story beat to bypass. A Link to the Past takes after Zelda 2 and features no soft locks on the world map. Progression on the Light World also takes after the structure of Zelda 2. Players must tackle each dungeon in a set order. The Dark World dungeons, however, are much closer in structure to the original Legend of Zelda. After completing the Dark Palace, players can complete the subsequent dungeons in a variety of orders. Players will even find a soft lock within a dungeon, as mentioned with Mire. On this playthrough, I tackled the dungeons in numerical order. On past playthroughs, however, I have generally tackled the 4th Dark World dungeon, Thieves Town, before venturing into Skull Woods. I occasionally tackle it before the Swamp Palace as well because it's one of my favorites in the game. I've also taken on Mire before traveling to the Ice Palace. By doing so, players can skip that lengthy puzzle that involves pushing the block from the floor above by just using the Cane of Somaria to create their own block. I think if more players did this, they would find the Ice Palace to be a lot more tolerable, actually. Now, changing the order of the main quest dungeons requires ignoring some pretty clear directions from the developers given to the players. I think this works for the most part, however. The game is still flexible, but there is less time spent lost. Players know where to go. The question is how to get in. Required quest lines aren't always apparent to the point that some, like the Flute Boy quest, are often referred to as side quests by commentators. Thanks for listening to this revisit of A Link to the Past. I hope you enjoyed it. The Game Boy Advance version of the game features an added dungeon, but it requires us to complete its companion game, Four Swords, in order to access it. So I will detail that dungeon later on in this season. I'll also touch on a few other changes in the Game Boy Advance version as well. Again, I'm not offering an exhaustive list of every change made, but I will touch on some of the bigger ones. Up next, I'm going to start my dive into Four Swords by discussing the development of that game. If you want to follow along, please subscribe. And a big thanks to everyone who has subscribed already. You are awesome. Thank you also if you've left a review on your favorite podcasting app or a comment and a like on YouTube. I really appreciate all you guys do to support my little podcast. It's gotten a lot bigger than I ever thought it would. Again, you're awesome. I'm Paul Riley, and I will see you next week.